You two don't belong in first class.
These are our confirmed seats. My crew feels threatened. Leave this aircraft. You're making a serious federal mistake. FAA Senior Inspector Marcus Webb. Open an investigation. Preserve
Every record from this flight.
The gate agent tore their boarding passes in half and dropped them on the counter like trash. That was the moment Marcus Webb knew exactly what kind of night this was going to be. Not from the torn tape paper, not from the smirk the man tried to hide, but from the way the woman beside Marcus went completely still, the way she always did when she was deciding whether something was worth her energy. Simone never wasted energy. She picked up the two halves of her boarding pass, pressed them together, and looked at the man behind the counter without blinking. "I'll need those reprinted," she said. Her voice was quiet. That particular kind of quiet Marcus had learned to recognize over 15 years of marriage. It was the voice she used in hospitals when a senior physician got something catastrophically wrong and hadn't realized it yet. The agent printed new passes without another word. That had been 40 minutes ago in the main terminal at George Bush Intercontinental. Now Marcus walked alongside Simone through the priority corridor toward Apex Airlines, gate D14, rolling carry-on in one hand, her hand in the other. The airport around them was a familiar kind of noise, muffled PA announcements, the mechanical hiss of automatic doors, the rolling thunder of hundreds of suitcase and silage wheels across polished concrete. Marcus had logged more hours in airports than most people spent in their own living rooms. He knew every frequency of this particular symphony, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't here to inspect anything. Simone adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced up at the departure board. "Paris in 4 hours," she said softly. 14 days of absolutely zero regulations. She tilted her head. "You say that every trip." "And I mean it every trip." She laughed, and the sound of it cut right through the noise of the terminal. It was the laugh she saved for him alone, the one that came from somewhere completely unguarded. Marcus held it in his chest like a breath he didn't want to release. 15 years, they had built a life around a shared mission, around late nights and missed dinners, and the constant, relentless work of making the sky safer. Marcus had spent 2 decades at the Federal Aviation Administration, climbing from field inspector to senior air carrier safety inspector. One of the senior officials who held the authority to ground fleets, audit entire airline operations, and flag violations that could result in tens of millions of dollars in fines. His word in certain rooms was federal law. Simone had followed a different path to the same destination, PhD in aerospace engineering, a medical degree. She was the FAA's leading consultant on human factors and aeromedical standards. The person who studied how fatigue and cognitive bias and the pressure of routine could erode a pilot's judgment without anyone noticing until it was too late. Half the crew training manuals flying in cockpits across North America contained her research. The other half quoted it. They had earned this trip in every possible way a person could earn something. 2 seats, 2 weeks. Paris. The priority boarding lane was nearly empty. A gate agent, young, harried, scanned their passes with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. and Dr. Webb," he said without looking up. The jet bridge air was cooler than the terminal, and they stepped aboard the Boeing 777 into the quiet wealth of the Polaris first-class cabin. Dark navy leather, individual pod seats, the kind of space that said without words, "You have arrived and you belong here." A flight attendant stood at the entrance, working through the practice choreography of a boarding smile. She was a woman in her mid-40s with her dark hair pulled back tight and a name tag that read Linda Parrish. "Welcome aboard," she said. The smile was correct. The eyes were not. Marcus noticed it immediately. Not a flicker of anything dramatics. Just a pause, a fraction of a second, where her gaze moved across them and something recalibrated. It was not the attentive sweep of a professional doing her job. It was the assessment of someone encountering an equation that did not balance. Good evening, Marcus said. Seats 2A and 2B. He held out their boarding passes. Linda took them. Read them again, then looked back at Marcus with a smile that had thinned almost imperceptibly at the edges. Right this way, she said. They found their seats. The pods were everything the ticket had promised. Wide, private, with small reading lights, and a surface smooth enough to set a champagne glass on without worry. Marcus lifted his carry-on into the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. Simone was already studying the touchscreen menu with the calm focus she brought to every new environment. Marcus was watching Linda Parrish. She had moved up toward the galley at the front of the cabin. She was speaking to someone out of his line of sight, her body angled slightly away. Her voice inaudible. But her posture said everything. The slight forward lean, the glance back towards seats 2A and 2B, the quick, tight nodding. You're doing the thing. What thing? The thing where you're inspecting something that hasn't failed yet. He shifted his eyes back to her, just taking in the cabin. We're on vacation, Marcus. I know. Then let it go. He almost did. He had spent 20 years developing the discipline to separate what he saw as an inspector from what he saw as a person. And most of the time, the two versions of himself coexisted without friction. He was good at compartmentalizing. He had to be. But Linda Parrish returned 8 minutes later with a silver tray and 2 champagne flutes. And the way she moved toward their pod had a quality to it that Marcus could not file away under coincidence. She was watching them the way you watched a situation you had already decided was a problem.
Pre-departure champagne?
Voice was half a register too high. That would be lovely, thank you, Simone said. Linda set the glasses down and her eyes did the slow sweep again. Suit, watch, shoes. The quiet, thorough inventory of someone adding numbers that were not adding up the way she expected. Are you familiar with everything in the Polaris cabin? She asked B. The question had a particular texture to it, smooth on the surface, something rougher underneath. We are, Marcus said. Thank you. She did not leave. Her weight shifted forward slightly, a small, almost involuntary movement. B. We sometimes have passengers who are upgraded at the last minute. It can be a little overwhelming, all the options. We just want to make sure everyone is comfortable and knows how everything works. The words were correct, B. The meaning was not, B. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He knew this feeling, B. He had known it in boardrooms and at inspections and in upscale restaurants and in 100 other places where someone had looked at him and decided the math did not work. It was not hostility, exactly, B. It was something more insidious. The soft, persistent suggestion that his presence required explanation. He took a slow breath. This was their anniversary. He had promised Simone 14 days of zero regulations. B. We appreciate that, he said. His voice was measured. Polite, a door that stays closed. We're all set. Linda Parrish smiled, thin as paper, and retreated toward the front of the cabin. Marcus watched her stop beside a man he had not noticed before. A man in his mid-50s with silver hair combed to a rigid precision, a name tag he could not read from this distance, and the posture of someone who was very accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. The two of them looked back toward seats 2A and 2B. The man's expression hardened into something with edges. Simone lifted her champagne flute, her eyes on the window. The lights of Houston spread out in the darkness beyond the glass, patient and indifferent. We're going to Paris, she said quietly, as if reminding herself. Marcus picked up his own glass. He wanted to agree. He wanted to believe the rest of the night would simply be the beginning of what they had planned. But the man with the silver hair was already walking toward them, and the expression on his face was not one Marcus had ever seen on someone delivering good news. His name tag read Thomas Holt, and he wore his authority the way some men wear expensive cologne. Too much of it, and in all the wrong places. He stopped at the entrance to their pod with a smile that arrived before any warmth did. I practiced expression that lived in the face rather than behind the eyes. He was the kind of man who had been told he was good at his job for so long that he had stopped questioning whether he actually was. "Good evening," he said. "I'm Thomas Holt, purser for this flight." He paused just long enough to let the title register. "I just need to take a moment to verify your seat assignments." Marcus looked at him steadily. "We're in 2A and 2B. Yes, I can see that." Holt glanced at the boarding passes Marcus held out, then back at him in the particular way of someone who has already decided what they are looking for and is simply waiting to confirm it. "There appears to be some discrepancy in our reservation system. We occasionally have passengers who are rerouted from other flights, and sometimes the seat assignments get crossed. It's a fairly common computer issue." Marcus knew airline reservation systems. He had reviewed enough incident reports and operational audits to understand how they worked, and more importantly, how they failed. They did not produce duplicate seat assignments after the cabin door was sealed. That particular variety of error was caught at the gate, sometimes at check-in, never here, never now. "Our tickets are confirmed," Marcus said. "Booked 2 months ago and paid in full." "Be that as it may," Holt said, and his voice developed a slight hardness. The kind that appears when someone realizes the conversation is not going the way they expected. "I need to see your purchase confirmation, the actual receipt." Across the aisle, the businessman in 3C, had lowered his newspaper. He was watching without any pretense of not watching. Simone looked up from her screen. She set the menu down on the tray table and gave Holt her full attention, which was, Marcus knew, an experience most people found more unsettling than they anticipated. She had a way of focusing on a person that made them aware of precisely how much of their reasoning was visible. "Is there a problem, Mr. Holt?" she asked. "Ma'am, I'm simply trying to ensure that, doctor," she said. A pause, small and significant. "Excuse me, doctor," she repeated, not sharply, precisely. The way she stated a fact in a clinical setting, without apology and without repetition after this one. "I have a PhD and a medical degree. The correct form of address is Dr. Webb." Something moved across Holt's face. Recalculation. Whatever narrative he had been constructing in the last several minutes had just added a complication it hadn't accounted for. "Of course," he said. The smile returned, smaller now. "Dr. Webb, I'm simply trying to ensure everyone is in their correctly assigned seat." Standard airline policy. He looked toward Linda Parrish, who had materialized at his elbow with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been positioned there deliberately. She stood slightly behind him and to his left, arms loose at her sides, and said nothing. Her presence alone was a form of statement. Marcus held his boarding pass at chest height, not threatening, not submissive, simply visible. "This is our boarding pass," he said. "Scanned and cleared at the gate by your own agent 20 minutes ago. I'm happy to show you the chassis. I am not going to provide a purchase receipt on a boarded aircraft to justify being in a seat I have legally occupied." Holt's jaw tightened fractionally. He had expected the request to produce a small scramble, a rummaging through bags, perhaps a flush of embarrassed effort. What he had gotten instead was a flat, clear refusal delivered without anger and without apology. "Our records indicate a possible issue," Holt said. He was improvising now, and Marcus could hear it. The specificity had left his language. He was working in vague terms that meant nothing and could not be verified. "In cases like this, we have to take precautions." "What kind of precautions?" Simone asked. Her voice had not risen. If anything, it had dropped, which was more effective. "We have to consider the possibility." Holt paused, searching for the right word, finding only the wrong one, that the documentation may not be entirely in order. Marcus understood what was not being said. He had heard it said in others' rooms in other ways for most of his adult life, but the shape of it never changed. But the shape error where you should not be. You are where you would be. You got in through some error or deception. The sooner you accept that and correct it, the easier this will be for everyone. He set his shamsheen flute on the tray table. The soft sound of glass on polished surface was the only thing that broke the silence. "Mr. Holt," Marcus said. His voice dropped into the register he used for formal proceedings. It was not a voice he had planned to use tonight. "I want to be very clear about something. My wife and I are in our assigned seats. We have presented valid documentation. You have raised an accusation of irregularity without a single piece of evidence and without any basis in your own airline's recorded manifest. That is not a policy enforcement action. That is a very different kind of problem." Holt's face flushed. He straightened his shoulders, the response of a man who mistakes stubbornness for authority. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," he said, his voice dropping to something conspiratorial and ugly. "But I have 25 years with this airline, and I know when something doesn't add up." Linda Parrish finally spoke. "We have to protect the integrity of the cabin." She said it with the rehearsed certainty of someone who had just remembered the phrase they had agreed on. "We can't have," she stopped. Started again. "Gate lice." The word landed in the air between them. Marcus looked at Linda for a long moment. She held his gaze for approximately 2 seconds. Then looked away at a point somewhere over his left shoulder. He turned back to Holt. "You have 2 options," Marcus said. The warmth was entirely gone from his voice now. What remained was something structural, load-bearing, the voice of a man who had spent 2 decades making consequential decisions in high-pressure environments and understood exactly how much weight words could carry. "You can return to your duties, and we will address your conduct with your supervisors upon landing. Or you can escalate this. Call the captain if that is your intention." He paused. "But I want you to understand something when you make that choice. If you escalate this, you will set in motion a chain of events that will not bend to tell your authority, your seniority, or your judgment. You will not be able to stop what follows. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" It was not a threat. It was a professional assessment. Marcus had spent 20 years delivering exactly this kind of information to airline executives, to operations directors, to chief pilots with 30,000 hours in their logbooks. It was the voice of the regulatory structure itself, calm and absolute, and entirely indifferent to what anyone in the room preferred. Thomas Holt heard none of that. What he heard was a challenge. A man who would not back down, a situation that required the authority of the flight deck to resolve. He turned on his heel and walked toward the cockpit. Linda Parrish followed. Marcus leaned back in his seat. The cabin was very quiet. The businessman in 3C had stopped pretending to read. A young woman in the row behind them was looking between Marcus and the retreating figure of Thomas Holt with an expression that mixed disbelief with something close to shame. Simone reached across the center console and put her hand over Marcus's. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have spent their careers preparing for a situation they both hoped would never arrive, and who now understood with perfect clarity that it had. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Gary Norris stepped into the cabin. He was tall, with silver hair cut close at the temples, and 4 gold stripes, conscious coops, that he wore with the unself-conscious confidence of a man who had not questioned his own authority in a very long time. He moved through the first-class cabin with the ease of someone who owned it, which in a practical sense he did. On this aircraft, in this airspace, his word was law. Marcus watched him approach and read the situation in the first 3 seconds. Norris was not coming to investigate. He was coming to difference. And it was the most important difference in the room. An investigating captain asked questions. A resolving captain had already decided on the answer and was simply here to deliver it. "Folks," Norris said, addressing the space roughly between them rather than either of them. Specifically, his voice carrying the easy, dismissive authority of a man who had never had to raise it. "I'm Captain Norris. Tells me there's some confusion about your seating." "There is no confusion," Marcus said. "There will be. There is, however, a false accusation of fraud being made against my wife and me by two members of your crew who have refused to accept valid documentation. Norris finally looked at him directly. The look was cool, the calculation. His purser of many years versus two passengers he had never seen before. In his mind, the outcome threat of that typical question was never in question. B. I don't have time to sort out ticketing disputes on the tarmac, Norris said. The phrase came out like something he had used before. Mr. Holt is responsible for the integrity of the cabin manifest. If he says there's an issue to maintain, we have to address it. We have a departure particular to maintain. Simone leaned forward. When she spoke, her voice had the particular precision of delivering a finding that is not open to negotiation. They took B. Captain, are you telling us that you are declining to review our documentation and choosing instead to accept an unverified claim from your crew as fact? Norris's expression shifted slightly. B. The professional pleasantness wearing thin at the edges. What I'm saying, ma'am, is that this discussion has run its course. The safety and security of this flight are my primary concern. B. When there is a disruptive situation in the cabin, before we even push back, we are not being disruptive, Marcus said. B. His voice was very quiet. We are sitting in our seats responding to harassment. That's a matter of perspective. Norris crossed his arms. My crew feels threatened. Marcus looked at the captain for a long moment. B. He had been in rooms with airline executives who used that kind of language before. It was a specific rhetorical structure. Take the behavior of the person doing the harassing, reassign it to the person being harassed, B, and use it as justification for the action already decided upon. B. It was a technique. Marcus understood it precisely, which was why he also understood that arguing against it in this context would produce nothing useful. My crew feels threatened was not an argument. B. It was a conclusion pretending to be an observation. You could not counter it with facts because facts were not what it was made of. So Norris continued, his tone dropping into finality. B. I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. You can resolve this with the gate agents. B. If your ticketing is verified, we'll get you on the next available flight. Somewhere in the cabin, a breath was drawn and held. The young woman in the row behind them made a small sound, not quite a word. B. The businessman across the aisle went very still. Marcus did not move. Captain Norris, he said. The authority in his voice was not performed. It was native, the way certain frequencies are native to certain instruments. B. I want you to confirm something for me. B. Because I want to be precise about what is happening here. You are invoking your captain's authority under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3 to remove ticketed passengers from this aircraft. B. You are doing so based on unverified claims from your crew, without reviewing any documentation, and under the stated justification of a disruptive situation that does not exist. B. Is that an accurate description of what you are doing? Norris paused, just for a moment. B. The specificity of the question, the precision of the regular regulatory citation, the kind of complete absence of emotional register in the man asking it, had introduced something into the air that had not been there before. He had expected anger. He had expected a protest. He had expected the kind of practiced response to. He had not expected this. But he was also a man who in a T had been told he was right about things for a very long time. Our day got time sat B, and the momentum of that history was stronger than the pause. That's correct, he said. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or do I need to call airport security? Marcus turned and looked at Simone. She met his eyes. Her face was composed in the way a face is composed when the person wearing it has made a decision they will not revisit. There was pain in it, real and unguarded, the pain of being judged for exactly what you were not. B. But beneath that, something unyielding, a bedrock. She gave a single, barely visible nod. This fight was over. The one that mattered was about to begin. Marcus stood. He did it slowly, B, with the kind of deliberate unhurriedness that communicates not surrender, but documentation. He took his carry-on from the overhead compartment. Simone stood beside him, and retrieved her bag. B. Their movements were coordinated and unhurried, the movements of two people, B, who had decided that every gesture they made in the next 60 seconds would be observed and remembered. Every eye in the first class cabin was on them. Marcus could feel the weight of those gazes the way you feel weather. Some of it was sympathy. Some of it was discomfort. Some of it was the particular unease of witnesses who know they are watching something wrong and have decided the cost of saying so is too high. No one spoke. B. The young woman in the row behind them looked at Simone with an expression that said everything she could not bring herself to say out loud. Simone met her gaze for exactly 1 second and gave her the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that passed between them and was gone. Thomas Holt and Linda Parrish had positioned themselves near the galley. Holt's picture had the slight inflation of someone who has gotten what they wanted. B. Linda's expression was harder to read, or would have been to anyone who hadn't spent 2 decades studying what people's faces did when they believed they were in the right. Marcus looked at them as he passed. He looked at each of them carefully and completely, the way a man looks at something he is committing to memory for official purposes. Then he continued up the aisle. The walk from seat 2A to the aircraft door was approximately 30 feet. B. Marcus would not have been able to explain afterward why it felt like something much longer. Perhaps because each step was measured, each step was logged. He was not walking in humiliation official, who had just witnessed a fetters of events that he would now be required to document with precision and report through official channel. They sipped out. The cabin door opened. The jet bridge air hit them, cool and sharp. They stepped out, and the door closed behind them with a sound that was final in a way that few sounds ever are. They stood on the bridge alone. The light was harsh and fluorescent, and below them, through the gap between the bridge and the aircraft, they could see the dark tarmac of Houston Intercontinental and a portion of the runway lights beyond. Their luggage was in the hold of the aircraft. Their seats were empty. The anniversary trip to Paris was over. Simone exhaled slowly, not a sigh, something steadier than that. She reached out and took Marcus's hand. Okay, she said. It was not defeat, it was orientation. I know where we are, and I know where we go from here. Marcus squeezed her hand once. Then they walked back up the jet bridge toward the terminal, and with every step, the calculation in Marcus's mind was becoming sharper, more precise, more certain. The anger was there. It was real and it was legitimate, and he was not pretending it wasn't. But anger was a tool, and right now he had a different tool to pick up. He had a phone, he had a badge number. He had 20 years of knowing exactly which number to call and exactly what to say when he called it. And he had a very clear memory of every word, every gesture, every violation he had just witnessed. The gate area at D14 was mostly empty. The last major departure had been 20 minutes ago, and the corridor had the hollow particular quiet of a space that had recently held a crowd and was now done with it. A few travelers with early morning connections slept across rows of chairs with their arms crossed over their bags. The gate agent looked up when Marcus and Simone emerged from the jet bridge. He was a young man, early 30s, with the expression of someone who had not expected his shift to produce anything unusual and was now unhappy about being wrong. The flight's closed, he said. What happened? Before either of them could answer, his phone rang. He listened. His eyes moved to Marcus, then to Simone, then back to his screen, with the practiced neutrality of someone absorbing bad news they had not created. Yes, sir. He understood. He set the phone down. His demeanor had reorganized itself into something more official, more distant. Captain Norris informs me you were removed for being disruptive. I can rebook you on the next available first-class departure to Paris. That would be in approximately 48 hours. We were not disruptive, Simone said. Her voice was steady. We were targeted by your crew, accused of fraud without basis, and removed from an aircraft we had paid for and legally boarded. The agent exhaled. He typed something. The keyboard sounds were the only thing in the space. I understand that's frustrating, ma'am, but the captain's call is final on the aircraft. That's the policy. He reached under the counter and produced 2 card envelopes. I can offer you hotel vouchers for tonight and meal credits. The hotel shuttle runs every. We won't be needing those. Marcus set his carry-on handle down with a sound that was soft but definite. He looked at the vouchers on the counter for exactly 1 second, then turned away from the counter and walked several paces down the empty corridor. The agent watched him go with a look that shifted between confusion and the first thin edge of something else. Marcus scrolled through his contacts. Alana, his mother, colleagues, friends. He moved through them without stopping. He found the number labeled FAA Duty Officer Southwest Region and pressed it. Simone stood beside him, not behind him. Beside him, the way she always stood when they were facing something together. She watched his face as the call connected. The voice that answered was professional and alert. FAA Southwest Regional Office. Agent Torres speaking. Marcus's voice changed. It was not a dramatic transformation. There was no shift in volume, no increase in tension. What changed was the register, the internal architecture of how the words were assembled. The man who had been a husband driving to the airport, who had been a traveler hoping for 14 days of Paris, who had been a passenger on the receiving end of 2 hours of deliberate humiliation, stepped back. What remained was something older and considerably more consequential. Agent Torres, this is FAA Senior Inspector Marcus Webb. Badge number 891 Bravo. I am at Houston Intercontinental Airport. Concourse D, Gate 14. At approximately 21:15 Central Time this evening, my wife, Dr. Simone Webb, and I were removed from Apex Airlines Flight 312, tail number November 742 Apex Alpha, Boeing 777, 300 extended range. A pause, the sound of a chair moving. Then typing. Fast focused typing. Inspector Webb, sir. Acknowledged. Can you describe the nature of the incident? The flight crew, specifically Purser Thomas Holt and flight attendant Linda Parrish, refused to accept our valid boarding passes for seats 2A and 2B. They escalated the confrontation to include a verbal accusation of fraud, the use of a known discriminatory slur, and a refusal to accept digital purchase confirmation that was presented in full and without ambiguity. We were subsequently removed from the aircraft by pilot and command captain Gary Norris under federal basis of regulations 1.3 on a stated was false. That basis was false. Captain Norris declined to review any documentation and made his determination solely on the representation of his crew. Marcus paused. He looked at the floor for exactly 1 second. Then he continued, Agent Torres, I am officially classifying this as a discriminatory incident in direct violation of Title 49 of the United States Code. Section 40,127(e), which prohibits discrimination by air carriers on the basis of race. Additionally, the pilot and command's failure to perform due diligence before exercising his authority under 91.3 constitutes a dereliction of duty under 14 CFR Part 121. I am requesting immediate action. Yes, sir. The voice on the other end had taken on a different quality. Careful, precise, the tone of someone who had just understood the full weight of what they were holding. What are your instructions? Contact the principal operations inspector for Apex Airlines tonight. I want the cockpit voice recorder from the moment Purser Holt entered the cockpit to the moment the cabin door was sealed. I want all internal security footage from the cabin preserved and flagged for official review. I want the FA certificate numbers for Captain Norris Purser Holt and Flight Attendant Parrish on my desk before morning. Dr. Webb and I will be filing our formal incident reports at the regional office first thing tomorrow. He paused. Apex Airlines Houston operations are under immediate elevated regulatory scrutiny as of this moment. This is not a courtesy call. This is a formal initiation of a compliance investigation. Understood, sir. Is there anything else I can do for you right now? Yes. Make sure someone gets to that aircraft before it crosses into international airspace and has the cabin footage secured. B. I want it preserved before anything happens to it. On it, sir. Marcus ended the call. B. He stood in the corridor for a moment. The anger was still there, a current running below the surface of everything, constant and real. But above it, something else had settled into place. The structure, the process. B. The machinery of the institution he had served for 2 decades, now engaged on his behalf because what had happened to him tonight was not merely personal. It was a violation of federal law, documented in real time, B, witnessed by a cabin full of people, B, and already reported. He turned back toward the counter. The gate agent was watching him. The expression on the young man's face had changed substantially in the last 3 minutes. He had heard enough of the call to understand the shape of it, even if he hadn't caught every word. He had seen Marcus's posture. He had heard that voice. Marcus walked back to the counter, reached into his jacket, and removed a credential wallet. He opened it and set it on the counter, face up under the terminal lighting. The gold badge of the Federal Aviation Administration reflected the fluorescent lights with a quiet authority that needed no amplification. My name is Marcus Webb, he said. This is Dr. Simone Webb. We are Federal Aviation safety officials. He let that settle for exactly 1 beat. You will not be rebooking our flight. You will be contacting your ramp supervisor immediately and having our luggage retrieved from Flight 312 before it leaves the gate. You will then locate your station manager and a senior representative from Apex Airlines corporate operations because both of them need to be in this building within the hour. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. I strongly suggest you make those calls now. The agent looked at the badge. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Simone. Something shifted in his eyes, a recalibration, the sudden disorienting experience of understanding that the two people standing in front of him were not what he had been told they were, and that the decision his captain had made 40 minutes ago on that aircraft was not going to stay inside the aircraft. His hands went to his phone. They were not entirely steady. Yes, sir, he said. Right away, sir. Simone looked at Marcus as the agent began to dial. Her expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more complicated. The look of someone who had known this moment was possible and had hoped, genuinely, that it would never be necessary. Happy anniversary, she said softly. He turned to her. The exhaustion was in his eyes now. The specific tiredness that came not from effort, but from the cost of staying composed when composed was the last thing you felt. We're in this together, he said. Always. She took his hand. They waited. Outside the terminal windows, the lights of Houston spread out in the darkness, patient and indifferent and entirely unaware that in a gate area at Concourse D, a federal investigation had just been set in motion that would travel faster and reach further than any aircraft departing that night. At 10:53 in the evening, a priority alert landed in Apex Airlines Operations Center outside Dallas like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward in every direction at once. The dispatcher who received it was a veteran named Raymond Collier, 22 years with the airline, a man who prided himself on having seen most of what commercial aviation could produce. He had managed weather diversions, medical emergencies, security holdbacks, and once, memorably, a flock of Canadian geese that had taken out 2 engines on approach to Denver. He had never once in 22 years, seen the specific priority flag that appeared on his screen at 10:53, regulatory intervention, direct communication from the FAA Southwest Regional Office, highest priority code. He read the preliminary summary. He read it again. Then he said very quietly, "Get me Diane Carmichael." Diane Carmichael, Vice President of In-Flight Services for Apex Airlines, was at a charity dinner at the Petroleum Club in downtown Dallas. She was seated next to the CEO of a medical equipment company, who had been telling her about his recent skiing vacation in a way that suggested she should find it more interesting than she did. Her phone was in her purse, set to silent, because dinner was dinner. But she wore a smartwatch for occasions exactly like this one. It vibrated against her wrist at 10:56 in a pattern she had configured to be unmistakable. 3 long pulses, pause, 3 short. The pattern she had assigned to the category she privately called nuclear. She excused herself from the table with a smile that revealed nothing. In the hallway outside the dining room, she read the message from her chief of staff on her phone. Code red. Flight 312, FA. Call immediately, she called. The operations supervisor on duty spoke quickly. When the situation has outrun the use of police, she listened. She determining has outrun the usual protocols. She asked 2 questions. When he finished, 2 B. The first was, what is the current status of Flight 312? The second was, what are the names of the 2 passengers? Marcus and Simone Webb. Diane closed her eyes for approximately 4 seconds. She did not need to look them up. She knew exactly who they were. Marcus Webb had led the last full operational audit of Apex Airlines. He had been meticulous, unhurried, and in possession of a memory that the airline's legal team had quietly described as photographic, and not in a flattering way. He knew the code of federal regulations the way surgeons know anatomy, not as something learned, but as something inhabited. The audit had resulted in a consent agreement that the airline had spent 18 months addressing. He was not a man who made informal complaints. Simone Webb was, if anything, more daunting. Her work on cognitive bias and crew decision-making was not simply atate influential. It was foundational. The training program that every Apex Airlines flight attendant had completed in the last 3 years was built substantially on frameworks she had developed. Her research had been presented before 2 congressional committees. The FAA had named a human factors protocol after a methodology she published. Diane's crew had not simply mistreated 2 people who happened to be black. They had walked into a first-class cabin and decided, on the basis of what they saw rather than what they knew, that 2 of the most consequential figures in American aviation safety did not belong there. And then they had acted on that decision in front of a cabin full of witnesses, with cameras recording on an aircraft whose voice and data recorders were now subject to federal seizure. She leaned against the corridor wall. The gravity of it settled into her like something physical. Lock it down, she said, when the operations supervisor finished speaking. Speak. Her voice was a controlled whisper, the voice of someone who understood that the next sentence she said was going to be quoted. No one from that flight crew makes any statement to anyone, not to the union rep, not to a spouse, not to each other. Get the Houston station manager to wherever Marcus and Simone Webb are right now, tonight. Have him bring a corporate representative with authority to speak on behalf of the airline. She paused. Treat them like they can end us with a phone call, because they can. She hung up and called her driver. 50 minutes later, Diane was in the Apex Airlines private lounge at Houston Intercontinental, a small, corporate gray room that the airline reserved for situations requiring privacy and had never expected to use under circumstances like these. Marcus and Simone Webb were already there. They had given their preliminary statements to an FAA duty officer over a recorded line. They had done so with a precision that the station manager, a pale man named Gillespie, who had driven from his home in Sugarland still wearing what he had fallen asleep in, described afterward as the most professionally efficient regulatory complaint he had ever witnessed. Diane stood in the doorway and looked at them for a moment before entering. Marcus was seated at the conference table with his jacket still on, a legal pad in front of him with handwritten notes that Diane could not read from the door, but could see were dense and organized. Simone sat beside him, her posture upright, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. They looked like what they were. 2 senior federal officials in the middle of official business, composed and focused, and entirely clear about what they were doing. They did not look like people who had just had their anniversary destroyed. Diane introduced herself. She offered every apology she had the authority to make. She meant them. She also knew that apologies at this point were procedural rather than substantive. The machinery was already in motion, and no amount of sincerity was going to change the trajectory of what came next. What she said before she left them to the FAA officers who arrived shortly after was this: I want you to know that we will cooperate completely with every element of this investigation. Every record, every recording, every document. We will not contest it, obstruct it, or manage it. She looked at both of them. What happened to you tonight was wrong, not complicated, not context dependent, wrong. Marcus looked at her steadily. We know you mean that, he said. We also know that it happened, and the investigation will determine what that means for the people who made it happen and for the airline that employs them. Diane nodded. It was not a nod of comfort. It was a nod of acknowledgement. She left them there, in the gray corporate room, under the fluorescent lights, and walked back out into the terminal. Her driver was waiting. She needed to be on the first flight to Paris in the morning, because when Flight 312 landed at Charles de Gaulle, she intended to be standing on the jet bridge. Outside the terminal window was a small set of lights moving across a black sky. They took already over the Gulf of Mexico, already heading east. Thomas Holt and Linda Parrish were somewhere in the forward galley, pouring coffee, convinced they had done exactly the right thing. Diane thought about that as her car pulled away from the curb. There was a particular kind of confidence, she reflected, that came from never having been wrong in a way that mattered. From operating within a system that had always validated your instincts and rewarded your authority, and never, once required you to confront the gap between what you believed and what was actually true. Thomas Holt and Linda Parrish had lived inside that system for 25 years. The next 48 hours were going to be educational. At 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, the sky outside the cabin windows was absolute dark. The passengers of Flight 312 had eaten, adjusted their blankets, and mostly surrendered to the particular drowsy suspension of long-haul night travel. In the forward galley, the overhead lights had been dimmed. The coffee was fresh. Thomas Holt sat in the jump seat with his arms crossed and his ankles on a small step below the galley cart, the posture of a man in moderate comfort and complete satisfaction. Linda Parrish stood beside the narrow counter, turning her paper cup in slow circles. You handled it perfectly, she said. Her voice was low, proprietary. The voice of someone congratulating herself in the second person. Thomas tilted his head in a gesture of modest acknowledgement. They were very sure of themselves. That kind of arrogance. It's always the way. Linda leaned against the partition. The ones who don't belong, they always overcorrect. The entitlement, the demands. It's a red flag once you know how to read it. She paused. 20 years and you develop an eye. Captain Norris saw it immediately. Thomas set his cup down. That's what good command looks like. He didn't let it become a scene. They were absolutely disruptive. Linda smoothed the front of her uniform. Belligerent. The way he quoted regulations at us like he was trying to intimidate us, like that would work. Exactly. Thomas nodded slowly. Classic intimidation. They do their research, throw around a few terms, try to make you doubt yourself. But you know what? I have 25 years of reading people. I know when something doesn't fit, and they didn't fit. He said it with the calm certainty of a man who had never been required to examine whether what he called experience was, in fact, a set of unexamined assumptions that had never been challenged because the system around him had always confirmed them. Linda yawned and stretched. 3-day Paris layover. I have a restaurant reservation Thursday evening. La Fontaine, Thomas said. I know the maitre d'. Of course you do. They laughed softly, the easy laughter of colleagues, who have worked together long enough to share a private language. The galley was warm. The aircraft was on schedule. The night felt orderly and complete. Neither of them had checked the two's alerts on the phones. Neither of them knew that 200 miles below, the Apex Airlines Operations Center in Dallas had been in crisis mode for the last hour and a half. Neither of them knew that Diane Carmichael had landed in Houston at 1 in the morning and was now en route to the airport hotel, where she would sleep for 3 hours before catching the 7 a.m. flight to Paris. Neither of them knew that an FAA compliance investigation had been formally opened, that a federal preservation order had been placed on all cabin security footage from their aircraft, that the cockpit voice recorder data was being copied right now by technicians in a maintenance bay at Intercontinental under the supervision of a regional FAA official. They knew only what they had always known, that they were good at their jobs, that their instincts were reliable, and that the situation they had managed tonight was an example of exactly the kind of professional judgment that 25 years in the industry produced. Thomas stood and took his cup to the small sink. Better do a pass through the cabin. I'll take 9 through 14, Linda said. They separated in the quiet way of people with a practiced routine, and the forward galley returned to its particular nighttime stillness. The coffee maker clicked softly as it maintained temperature. The auxiliary power hummed at its low constant frequency. Outside, the darkness was total. In Houston, in the private lounge at Concourse D, Marcus and Simone finished their formal preliminary statements at 2:17 in the morning. The FAA duty officer on the other end of the recorded line thanked them, confirmed the case number, and reiterated that all preservation orders were in place. The station manager, Gillespie, had been replaced after an hour by two corporate representatives flown in from the Dallas regional office, who had said all the correct things and taken very careful notes. Simone had requested that her luggage, retrieved from the aircraft hold before it left the gate, be brought to the lounge. The suitcase containing her Paris wardrobe sat now beside the door with a calm that contrasted sharply with the hours it had been through. The two of them sat in the quiet room after the corporate representatives left. The overhead lights were still fluorescent and unforgiving. The coffee on the table had gone cold. Marcus looked at the table, not at anything in particular, just at the surface of it, at the grain of the laminate that was pretending to be wood. Simone watched him for a moment. Say it, she said. He looked up. Say the thing you've been keeping internal for the last 4 hours. He exhaled, not a sigh, something that had been held for a long time and needed release. I wasn't angry when Karen Miller gave us that look boarding. I wasn't even angry when Holt showed up. I've had that conversation 100 times in 100 different rooms. You learn to absorb it and keep moving. He paused. What I keep coming back to is Norris. She waited. He had the information. He could have looked at the passes. He could have taken 45 seconds and reviewed what we presented. That's all it would have taken. And he chose not to because his crew said something, and in his mind that was sufficient. 30 years in aviation, and the word of two people looking us and deciding we didn't belong was more credible to him than the documents we were holding. He set his hands flat on the table. That's not malice. That's something worse than malice. Not me. That's a system that has taught him over and over that certain kinds of instincts are trustworthy, and he has never once had reason to question it. Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the paper I've been trying to get funded for 3 years. He looked at her. The one on implicit authority validation, she said. The way rank structures in enclosed, high-stress environments reinforce pre-existing cognitive biases rather than correcting them. I have the theory. I have the methodology. What I needed was a case study complex enough to carry the argument. Marcus stared at her. Then, despite everything, despite the fluorescent lights and the cold coffee and the suitcase by the door containing the clothes that she had packed for Paris, he almost laughed. Are you telling me you're workshopping a research paper right now? I'm telling you that what happened to us tonight is going to mean something, she said, beyond the investigation, beyond the fines. I intend to make sure of that. He looked at her face. The exhaustion was there, real and visible. But beneath it, something else, the particular kind of energy that her work gave her, the way her mind never fully rested when it was near a problem that mattered. He had married this woman 15 years ago because of precisely that hurt her, in turn took the things that hurt her and turned them into something that helped other people. Because she had never, in all the years he had known her, allowed pain to stop at pain. Okay, he said. She squeezed his hand. We'll go to Paris, he said, not on this trip, but we'll go. Yes, she said, we will. Outside the windows of the lounge, the Houston night was beginning its slow transition toward gray. Somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic, Flight 312 was making good time. Its crew was still unaware. The reckoning had a schedule of its own. Flight 312 began its descent at 6:42 in the morning Paris time, banking gently through a ceiling of gray cloud over the Normandy coast, before straightening onto the approach corridor for Charles de Gaulle. Captain Gary Norris made the standard arrival announcement in the voice he always used for it, warm and practiced, the voice of competent completion. On behalf of Apex Airlines and our entire crew, welcome to Paris. We hope you've enjoyed your flight and look forward to serving you again. In the forward galley, Linda Parrish and Thomas Holt were working through their pre-arrival checklist. Collect trash. Secure service items. Verify that seat belts were fastened in row 1 through 8. The routine was muscle memory after this many years. They moved through it efficiently, without the need for communication. Thomas was thinking about his Paris apartment key, which he kept on a keychain shaped like the Eiffel Tower that his niece had given him 12 years ago. He was thinking about coffee at the brasserie 2 blocks from the hotel where layover crews stayed, and about that 3 days felt like exactly the right amount of time. Linda of them was thinking about Marcus and Simone Webb. The wheels touched down at 7:14. A brief scorch of runway, then the mechanical deceleration that pushed everyone slightly forward in their seats. The engines reversed. The aircraft turned off the active runway and taxied toward Terminal 1, Gate 7. Thomas moved to the forward door as the aircraft slowed to a stop. He went through the arrival procedure, checked the pressure indicator, confirmed the jet bridge was docked, disengaged the door. Standard. Automatic. He had done it more times than he could estimate. He pulled the handle and swung the door open, and he stopped. Diane Carmichael was standing on the jet bridge. She was dressed in a dark gray suit that she appeared to have slept in because she had. Behind her stood 2 men in dark coats that had a specific texture of corporate authority. No baggage, no departure board visible from where they stood. They were not here to catch. Thomas's hand was still on the door handle. Thomas's hand stayed. Diane looked at him with the expression of someone who has had hours to decide exactly what her face will do when this moment arrives, and has made peace with all of it. Thomas, she said. Her voice was flat and without warmth. Keep the passengers on board for now. I need you, Captain. And Linda come with me. Thomas felt a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. Jessica, Diane, what is this? Is something wrong? Yes, she said. A great deal is wrong. Get your crew. The room was deep inside the airport's operations area, reached through a service corridor that most passengers never saw. Bare walls, rectangular table with 4 chairs on one side and 2 on the other. Overhead lights that produced no warmth. The 2 men from corporate security stood beside the closed door. Captain Norris had entered the room with the bearing of a man accustomed to being the authority in whatever space he occupied. Cease. He had it still, but it sat without incident. His crew was professional. He had made a sound, rational decision in Houston. He was prepared to defend it. Diane sat across from them and opened a folder on the side of the table. She did not ask how the flight had gone. She said, at approximately 9:35 last night Central Time, you removed 2 passengers from Flight 312. Tell me exactly what happened. Captain Norris. Begin. Norris adjusted his posture slightly. It was a straightforward situation. 2 passengers were creating a disruption in the first-class cabin before departure. My purser had a legitimate concern about the authenticity of their documentation. B. When they became confrontational and refused to cooperate, I made the call to deplane them in the interest of flight safety. B. By the book. By the book, Diane repeated. She wrote nothing. She looked at him. We had a schedule to maintain and a cabin that needed to be secure for departure. My crew brought a potential security issue to my attention, and I acted on it. That's what the authority under 91.3 is for. Diane's gaze moved to Thomas. Mr. Holt, what specifically made you believe their tickets were fraudulent? Thomas straightened. B. He had the slight forward lean of a man ready to explain something he considers self-evident. They didn't present the profile of typical first-class clientele. Something about them was off. 25 years in this job, B. You develop a sense for when something isn't right. They became aggressive when I asked for additional documentation. The escalation itself was a red flag, Linda. Diane's voice did not change. Your assessment, B. Linda nodded once. They had an attitude, B. When Thomas asked reasonable questions, they got defensive. Real first-class passengers don't do that. We were trained to identify potential issues and escalate appropriately. That's what we did. Silence, B. Diane closed the folder. She did not need what was in it for this part. She had memorized it on the overnight flight. The passengers you removed, she said, are Marcus and Dr. Simone Webb. 3 blank faces. B. The names meant nothing. Perhaps their titles are more recognizable. B. Her voice had dropped to something very measured, very deliberate. The man you accused of fraud and identified as a security threat is FAA Senior Air Carrier Safety Inspector Marcus Webb. B. He personally led the last full compliance audit of this airline. He is the individual who holds the authority to place our operational certificate under review. She paused. B. The woman whose professional title you declined to acknowledge is Dr. Simone Webb. She holds a PhD in aerospace engineering and a medical degree. B. She is the FAA senior consultant on human factors in aviation. Her research is the foundation of the crew training program that every person in this room has completed. A sound from Linda. Small, involuntary. Not quite a word. Thomas Holt's face had changed. The color was going out of it in stages, the way a room dims when someone begins switching off the lights one by one. Captain Norris had come away from the table, not moving toward the door, B, but not quite in his chair either. The way a person stands when their body has made a decision, the rest of them hasn't caught up with yet. The cabin full of witnesses, Diane continued, includes a woman in row 3 who has already provided a written statement to the FAA. The gate agent at D14 saw Inspector Webb's federal credentials. The phone call from Inspector Webb to the FAA duty officer has been logged and recorded. B. The cockpit voice recorder data from the moment Mr. Holt entered the flight deck is in custody. She picked up the folder. While you were serving the breakfast service over the Atlantic, B. Inspector Webb had already initiated a federal investigation. Your FAA airman certificates have been flagged pending review. The room was very quiet. Thomas Holt spoke first. B. His voice was reduced to something considerably smaller than it had been 20 minutes ago. It was a mistake, he said. We didn't know. B. No, Diane said. She looked at him the way a person looks at something that can no longer be helped. You didn't. That's exactly the problem. She stood and picked up her folder. You are all grounded effective immediately. B. You will be flown back to Houston tomorrow in economy. You will surrender your company credentials and travel documents to security before leaving this room. You will not communicate with one another, B, with union representatives or with anyone in the media, B, until you have met with our legal team and the FAA investigators. She moved toward the door. Thomas said quietly, it was a gut feeling.
25 years.
Your gut feeling, Diane said, and she stopped with her hand on the door. Just cost this company millions of dollars and may cost us our operating certificate. She looked at him. And for what it's worth, they were probably interesting people on that entire flight, B. But you never gave yourself the chance to find out. She opened the door and walked out. The two security men remained. The three of them sat in the Paris morning in a room without windows, and the layover they had been anticipating dissolved around them like smoke. The investigation did not move like news. It moved like water, finding the lowest point in every surface, patient and without drama, reaching into places that looked sealed. Marcus and Simone recused themselves from the direct investigation within 24 hours of the incident. The rules governing conflicts of interest were unambiguous, and neither of them had any desire to compromise the process. They had set the machinery in motion. What it found, it would find without them. What it found was considerable. The FAA's Office of Civil Rights interviewed Linda Parrish over 2 days in a conference room at the agency's Houston field office. She was accompanied by a union representative who, by the end of the second day, had stopped offering encouragement. Linda had entered the interviews with the manner of someone who expected the process to recognize the validity of her professional judgment. What the process recognized was different. When the interviewer asked her to describe, in specific and operational terms, what exactly had indicated to her that Marcus and Simone Webb's tickets were potentially fraudulent, Linda produced answers that she believed were factual. She described the way they carried themselves, the way they responded to questions, the sense she had developed over 20 years of service that certain passengers required closer attention than others. She used the words profile and instinct and experience, and she used them without any apparent awareness that she was, in front of a federal investigator, on the record, documenting the precise mechanism of racial discrimination in real time. The investigator wrote it all down. Linda's FAA airman certificate was suspended within 3 weeks of the incident, pending formal proceedings. The notice arrived by email on a Tuesday morning. It informed her that the agency had determined her actions were inconsistent with the judgment required of a certified flight attendant, and that her certificate was under review for possible revocation. 20 years of flight hours, the route system she had memorized, the aircraft type she had logged, the seniority she had accumulated. All of it was now contingent on the outcome of a process she had no mechanism to control. She did not return to the air. Thomas Holt's proceedings moved faster. The witness testimonies were the deciding factor. The woman from seat 3G, whose name was Rachel Okafor and who was a contract attorney in her early 30s, had provided the FAA with a statement that was 7 pages long and detailed the sequence of events from the moment Thomas Holt first approached Marcus and Simone's pod. Her account matched the cabin security footage with the precision of someone who had been trained to observe and document. The businessman from across the aisle, a regional bank vice president named Douglas Kirby, who had felt guilty about his silence for 2 weeks before contacting the FAA's Office of Civil Rights on his own initiative, corroborated her account on every material point. Thomas was identified as the primary instigator. His certificate was revoked. The notice described his conduct as constituting deliberate escalation of a discriminatory confrontation in direct violation of applicable federal law. He appealed. The appeal was denied in 60 days. His 25 years of tenure, his Paris apartment key, his sense of himself as a professional of discernment and authority, none of it had weight in the proceedings. The proceedings dealt only in what had happened and what it meant under the law. Captain Gary Norris was the most complex case, and it took the longest. The FAA's position, ultimately, was that his failure was not primarily one of prejudice but of command. He had been presented with a situation that required investigation and had instead treated it as a situation that required resolution. He had trusted his crew's assessment over documented evidence without the minimal scrutiny that his authority and his regulatory obligations demanded. Whether his reasons for that trust were conscious bias or professional complacency or simple overconfidence in a crew member he had worked beside for years, the outcome in terms of duty was identical. His certificate was not revoked. It was suspended for 14 months. To recover it, he was required to complete a program that the FAA designed specifically for the Norris case, 400 hours of structured retraining, including regulatory review, conflict assessment, crew resource management, and a module on implicit bias in authority structures that was, quietly and without attribution, largely based on a paper that Simone Webb had submitted for publication. 3 months after the incident, Apex did not reinstate his command that they would not reinside him, regardless of the outcome of the FAA proceedings. He spent the suspension working a desk for consulting that had taken him on as a favor to a mutual contact. If he eventually recovered his certificate, the best available position would be first officer on a regional operation. The 4 stripes he had worn with the ease of a man who had never imagined taking them off were gone. The airline itself faced a different of reckoning. At Thies, Marcus's colleagues, the investigation led by Marcus's colleagues in the FAA's commercial aviation division, found what investigations into large organizations often find when they look carefully, that the incident on Flight 312 was not a deviation from the norm. It was the norm expressing itself more visibly than usual. There were 47 documented passenger complaints over the previous 5 years alleging discriminatory treatment by Apex Airlines and flight staff. 23 of those complaints had been closed without meaningful review. 11 had resulted in notes and personnel files. 8 had resulted in formal counseling. 5 had been escalated to what the airline called its Bias Review Committee, a body that met quarterly and had, in 12 years of existence, never once recommended formal disciplinary action. The pattern was clear. It was not clear because anyone had designed it to be a pattern. It was clear because no one had been adequately motivated to interrupt it. The fine the FAA levied was $2,750,000. The fine, it was one of the largest single incident discrimination fines in the agency's history. Apex Airlines announced through its legal department that it did not intend to contest the finding. The consent decree that followed was 41 pages. Among its requirements, a mandatory 40-hour bias recognition and de-escalation training course for all 22,000 members of the airline's flight crew and cabin staff to be completed within 18 months. An independent passenger complaint review board with an FAA-appointed monitor. A no-fault internal reporting mechanism for crew members who observed potentially discriminatory behavior by colleagues, and a consultant appointed by the FAA to design and approve the new training curriculum. Dr. Simone Webb took a formal leave of absence from her other duties. She spent the next 8 months writing the playbook, not as punishment toward the people who would be required to complete it. As an engineer approaches a system that has failed by identifying the exact point of failure, understanding why it was designed that way, and redesigning it so that failure becomes structurally improbable. The curriculum she produced was dense and specific and human. It did not ask participants to feel differently about anything. It asked them to examine the gap between what they believed they were seeing and what they could factually confirm. It asked them to apply the same standard of evidence to a person's right to be somewhere that they would apply to any other operational decision. It gave them language and process for the moment when instinct and obligation came apart. She was not asked to conduct training sessions herself. She would not have wanted to. The work was in the document. The document would outlast the incident that produced it. A major aviation publication ran a story on the consent decree. A national newspaper picked it up. The headline on the February story, the sidebar, was brief. FAA consultant who designed new anti-bias training, was one of the passengers removed from the flight. The story moved across social media with the particular velocity of a narrative that had every element of a parable: injustice, competence, irony, and the peculiar satisfaction of consequence, delivered by the precise mechanism that the injustice had tried to override. Apex Airlines stock price dipped. Its brand had, as one airline industry analyst wrote, just become a case study in what happens. B. When the people you decide don't belong in your premium cabin are the people who wrote the rules your premium cabin operates under. Marcus read the coverage from his office. He set his phone down and looked at the work on his desk. The current audit file, the pending inspection report, the stack of regulatory correspondence that would have been there with or without any of this. He about the specific night in the Houston private lounge. When Simone had told him about the paper, she had been trying to get funded for 3 years. He thought about what she had said. What happened to us tonight is going to mean something. He picked up his coffee. He went back to work. 6 months after the night at Gate D14, Simone Webb submitted the final version of the Apex Airlines Bias Recognition Curriculum to the FAA's Oversight Committee. It was 412 pages, including appendices, methodology notes, and a research bibliography that ran to 31 pages on its own. The Oversight Committee reviewed it over 3 weeks. The FAA monitor appointed to the consent decree sent her a letter of acceptance that used the word rigorous 4 times in 2 paragraphs. Apex Airlines printed it into spiral-bound binders and shipped copies to Crevi Crudo Base in their system. Training began the following Monday. Simone learned about the training launch from a news alert on her phone. She was at her desk at the FAA Research Center, reviewing data from a completely different project. She read the alert. She set the phone face down and went back to the Evada. Marcus learned about it by the way from the same alert in a different city at a conference on aviation safety protocol that he had been scheduled to speak at long before any of this happened. He read the alert in a hotel corridor between sessions. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put his phone in his jacket pocket and went back into the conference room. There was no celebration between them. They talked that night on the phone, the way they always did when Marcus was traveling, and the curriculum came up briefly, a thing accomplished and noted and then set aside, the way professionals mark milestones in the middle of ongoing work. There were other files on Simone's desk. There were other inspections on Marcus's schedule. The world had not paused for Flight 312. They had not expected it to. What they had expected was Paris. It was Marcus who made the reservation. He chose a different airline, a different departure day, a different route. He did not discuss the choice at length. He simply sent Simone a link to the confirmation and said, 6 months overdue. She wrote back, pick me up at 7. The morning they left was gray and mild. The specific Houston weather of early November that never quite decided whether it wanted to be cold. They drove to the airport together. They went through security together. They walked through the terminal together with the unhurried pace of 2 people who had been through airports more times than they could estimate and had made their peace with all of it. Their boarding passes this time were for seats 1A and 1B on a carrier whose first-class cabin had a different color scheme and a slightly smaller champagne selection. The gate agent was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck who scanned their documents and handed them back with the direct and uncomplicated courtesy of someone doing her job well. Good morning, Mr. and Dr. Webb. Have a wonderful flight. The jet bridge was the same temperature they always were. The aircraft was a different aircraft, but smelled the same, that particular manufactured air of recycled atmosphere and industrial upholstery. The first-class cabin had fewer pods and slightly more legroom. A flight attendant met them at the door, young, with a friendly and professional demeanor, no agenda behind his eyes. Simply a person at work, doing the thing he had been trained to do. Welcome aboard. Can I take any bags? We're fine, thank you, Marcus said, of course. Let me know if there's anything you need. They found their seats, stowed their bags, settled in. The cabin filled slowly around them with the measured pace of priority boarding. No one looked at them with anything in their eyes except the mild, mutual indifference of fellow passengers. Simone adjusted the reading light above her seat and opened a book she had been trying to start for 2 months. Marcus watched the airport ground crew moving below the window. The choreography of departure preparation that he had spent 20 years examining for gaps and deficiencies, and had never fully learned to see as anything but operational data. He was trying. That counted for something. You're doing the thing again, Simone said, without looking up from her book. I'm looking out the window. You're inspecting the ground crew. He moved his gaze away from the window. Better? She turned a page. Marginally. The cabin door closed. The safety demonstration began. Marcus noticed a single procedural deviation in the way the flight attendant indicated the floor level lighting, a minor inconsistency that was well within acceptable parameters, and made a decision to say nothing about it to anyone. The decision required active effort. The aircraft pushed back, taxied, lined up on the runway. Marcus looked at Simone. She had lowered her book and was looking back at him. Her face in the window light was exactly the face he had been looking at for 15 years, familiar in the way that only things you choose every day become familiar, not as repetition, but as accumulation. He thought about the night at gate D14. He thought about the walk down the aisle and sound of the cabin door closing behind them, and the cold air of the jet bridge, and Simone's hand in his. He thought about the private lounge, and the cold coffee, and the fluorescent lights, and about the phone call, and about the way Simone said, "Sir, what happened to us tonight is going to mean something," and had not been wrong. He thought about the 41-page consent decree and the 412-page curriculum and the $2,750,000 and the $2,000 and the three people whose careers had ended, and the system that was incrementally being modified by the specific force of what had happened to them. It was not nothing. He was clear about that. It was not justice in the simple sense, the kind that arrives with finality and leaves nothing unresolved. It was the other kind, the kind that works slowly and imperfectly and leaves behind it a structure slightly better than the one it replaced. He would take it. He had spent 20 years understanding that aviation safety worked exactly this way, through small improvements compounded across time, through each failure examined and addressed, so that the same failure became less likely. He believed in that method. He had given his professional life to it. The engines came to full power. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with the familiar gathering force, the momentum that built in the chest before it registered in the body. The ground fell away. The gray Houston sky opened above them, and they lifted into it, banking gently south and then east. Simone reached across the armrest and took his hand. Paris, she said. He looked at her. The light was changing outside the window as they climbed through the cloud layer, the gray giving way to the particular white that existed just above it, and then breaking into the full, unobstructed blue of altitude. Paris, he said. She smiled. Not the small, composed smile she wore in meetings and conferences and official proceedings. The other one. The one from the airport terminal 6 months ago that had cut right through the noise and landed in his chest. He held onto it. Below them, the city diminished. The airport became a pattern of runways and taxiways, and structures too small to read. Somewhere in that pattern was gate D14. Somewhere in that pattern was the private lounge, and the statement they had given, and the conversation they had had with each other in the small hours of the morning. The conversation about meaning and purpose and what you do with the things that hurt you. The aircraft climbed. The city disappeared into cloud. The blue above them was absolute and clear. They were going to Paris. Finally, without ceremony, without drama, without anyone standing in the aisle telling them they didn't belong. It was a small thing. It was also everything. Paris in November is not the Paris of postcards. The light comes in low and diffused through cloud, turning the stone facades of the arrondissements a soft, almost silver gray. The Seine runs darker than in summer. The cafe terraces have their awnings half extended against the possibility of rain, and the city soothes with a different quality, more internal, more deliberate, as if the warmth has been traded for depth. Marcus and Simone spent 14 days in it. They had a small apartment in the 5th arrondissement that a colleague of Simone's had helped them find, the kind of place that had no elevator and creaky wooden stairs, and a kitchen window with a view of a courtyard where someone kept a bicycle that was never ridden. It smelled of old stone and coffee and the faint residue of decades of living. It was nothing like a hotel. It was exactly right. They were not there to see the Paris that tourism requires. They had seen the Eiffel Tower before, from conference distances, from the windows of taxis, headed to meetings. They were there to see what Paris looked like when it was not performing for anyone. They walked mornings along the Quais Porus Pasic, picked up past the second-hand bookstalls, the rivers that lined the river, through neighborhoods they had no reason to be in except curiosity. They ate at the restaurants where nobody spoke English, and the menus were handwritten, and the portions were generous in a way that had nothing to do with excess and everything to do with satisfaction. They sat in parks in the thin afternoon light and read their separate books and said very little. On the 5th day, it rained. They stayed inside with coffee and worked their way through a crossword puzzle that took them 3 hours because it was in French, and their French was good enough to be overconfident, but not good enough to be fast. They argued cheerfully before a cross for 20 minutes. Marcus was wrong. He conceded gracefully. It was the most content he had felt since before the night at Gate D14. He did not stop being an FAA inspector for the 14 days. He would not have known how. He noticed the safety card is the seat pocket of the Air France shuttle they took to visit a friend of Simone's in Lyon. He noted the maintenance access panel on a taxi at Charles de Gaulle that had been incorrectly reattached. He could not prevent the observations from occurring. What he could do was set them down again, which he did, and return to being the man who was in Paris with his wife. Simone worked on her paper during the early mornings before Marcus woke, in the kitchen with the courtyard view. The paper on authority validation and cognitive bias, the one she had been trying to get funded for 3 years. The one that now had a case study specific enough to anchor the argument. She had not told the editor of the journal that the case study was her own. The paper would be stronger without that information. The argument would stand on the data. She submitted the final draft on the morning of their 12th day. That evening, they walked along the scene to a restaurant Marcus had found in a guide that was 12 years old, which meant the restaurant was either still excellent or long closed, and found that it was still excellent. The waiter brought something ate extra at the end. A small plate of sweets that they had not ordered. A small plate of sweets that they had not ordered. And said only that it was from the kitchen. It was that kind of restaurant. Walking back along the river, Simone stopped on a bridge and looked out at the reflection of the city lights in the water. The light fractured against the current, moving and not moving, present and dissolving. Do you think about what would have happened? She said, if we hadn't known, if we'd just been Marcus and Simone, and not had the badge and Simone Webb, and not had the badge and the title and the authority to push back? Marcus stood beside her and looked at the same water. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The river moved below them, indifferent and patient. I think about the people who are Marcus and Simone Webb without the badge, she said, who have the same right to be wherever they are and no mechanism to prove it in a way the system is forced to recognize. I know. The curriculum helps, she said. The investigation helped. The fine helped. It's not enough. No, he said, but it's more than there was before. She turned her head and looked at him. Is that enough? He thought about it. About the 41-page consent decree and the training manuals in spiral-bound binders and the 3 careers that had ended and the oversight committee and the no-fault reporting mechanism. About the system, slow and imperfect and structurally resistant to the kind of change that a single incident could fully accomplish. About the gap between what had been done and what still needed to be done. It's enough to be worth doing, he said. It's not enough to be finished. She turned back to the river. After a while, she said, "Thank you for planning this trip." He looked at her. Her face in the Paris light was quiet. In particular, the face of someone who has decided what things are worth and keeps that knowledge somewhere internal where it doesn't wear out. "Happy anniversary," he said. 15 years late and exactly on time. She smiled. They walked back to the apartment in the fifth arrondissement. The wooden stairs creaked. The courtyard was dark and quiet below the kitchen window. They made coffee they didn't need and sat at the small table and talked about nothing consequential for a long time, the way you talk, when the consequential has been handled and you have given yourselves permission to rest. On their last morning, Marcus stood at the window with his coffee and looked at the courtyard. The bicycle was there, as always. Somewhere above the roof lines, a church bell was marking 8 o'clock with the particular patience of something that has been marking time for a very long time and intends to continue. He thought about the young woman from seat 3G, Rachel Okafor, who had given 7 pages of testimony to the FAA and whose words had helped revoke a certificate. He thought about Douglas Kirby, who had been silent on the aircraft and then called the FAA the bank vice president, D. Pointrap Cheer. He thought about an agent who stomped on initiative T. He too thought about the gate agent 2 weeks later when he picked up his phone to call his supervisor. He thought about all the moments where something different could have happened. He thought of where one person saying something out loud or looking more carefully or pausing before acting on an instinct they had never examined would have changed the architecture of that night entirely. He finished his coffee. He set the cup down, cut it down. He and Simone had a flight to catch. They left the apartment keys in the lockbox. They rolled their suitcases down the creek stairs for the last time. They took a taxi to the airport, where the terminal was already busy with the particular morning energy of departures. All the various beginnings that airports traffic in. Marcus checked the pressure indicator on the aircraft door out of habit when they boarded, noted it was correct, and said nothing about it to anyone. The aircraft lifted off the Paris runway on a clear, cold morning, climbing into the winter blue. Below them, the city arranged itself into its familiar pattern, the river threading through it, the monuments they had not visited distinguishable even from altitude. It grew small. It became an abstraction. Then the cloud layer closed over it, and there was only the blue. Simone had her book. Marcus had the window. The flight was full and smooth and unremarkable in all the best ways. He leaned against the headrest and closed his eyes. Wherever you are reading this, whatever brought you to this story, consider the next time you find yourself in a space of automatic assumption. The next time certainty arrives before evidence. The next time someone's presence in a room requires explanation that their presence alone should not require. That pause, that half second between instinct and action, is where everything lives. Not the drama of the investigation, not the consequence of the reckoning, but the ordinary private moment where a person decides whether to look more carefully or less. The sky at altitude, is the same for everyone who has earned a seat in it. If you know someone who needs to hear that, share this story. And if it stayed with you, let us know why. The conversation is always worth having.